Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the first of the many sessions for responsible AI today. I am super excited to be having the team from the Foundation for Machine Learning Best Practices meet us today and introduce some of the great work that they're doing in the area of promoting a better and responsible AI. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the full team. Maybe each one of you can briefly introduce themselves, and then you can start the presentation.
Yep, perfect. I think I'll jump in first. My name is Daniel Vale, and I am legal counsel for data science and AI at the H&M Group. I'm also a PhD candidate at Leiden University in machine learning and law. And I am, along with Violeta and Chris, a member of the Foundation for Best Practices in Machine Learning. Christopher, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Chris Stocks. I work at Solos AI, which is a US-based software and consulting company. I'm a manager on our consulting side in algorithmic fairness and data science practices. So we help companies across all kinds of industries, credit, insurance, employment, test their algorithms for discrimination, fairness, and help sort of mitigate disparities when they're found. Violeta?
Yes, Violeta Misheva. I'm a senior data scientist at ABN AMRO Bank, which is a big Dutch bank. I'm based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where it's evening time now. I am a vice chair of the Foundation for Best Practices in Machine Learning.
Perfect. Should we get started? Chris,
yeah, please go ahead. Start sharing your screen, and we'd love to see the presentation.
Perfect. I'm going to turn off my camera while Christopher presents. So thanks for joining us, everyone, today. We're going to talk about the Foundation for Best Practices in Machine Learning, and more specifically, our aim to help promote ethical and responsible machine learning practices. So, Christopher, could you do the next slide? Oh, yep. So I think, like all good stories, one should start at the beginning and perhaps start with the problem of why we think that there is this need for ethical and responsible machine learning. I think our primary concern, which is quite well recognized across the market and is increasingly having a stronger dialogue in machine learning circles, is the recognition that if developed and deployed carelessly, machine learning can result in harm and unfair consequences. Use cases of this or examples of this have been found quite frequently across the banking sector, as well as other sectors, such as the medical industry. So there have also been, I guess, another issue that we saw, and this was one of the big issues that drove us to believe that we should champion ethical and responsible machine learning, specifically through our best practices. Another issue we had was that there were various guidelines by numerous institutions, and most of these were very impractical when it came to implementation, and all had very kind of normative aspects to it that we did not necessarily agree with. So we also saw a need for the foundation to emerge out of this context. We wanted to go for a very practical application on how to operationalize responsible machine learning, mainly in a robust, secure, and lawful manner. And we thought that we could fulfill this void and not fall into the normative trappings that it is already. And the final need why we thought these best practices and foundation should come about was essentially because it's obviously really hard to operationalize responsible machine learning and ethical machine learning without proper organizational context and structure and support. And so this is where the foundation tries to come in and offer support and more principally offer guidance. So what is the foundation, Christopher? So the foundation is a non-profit, and our principal aim is to create open source best practices that are freely available for the public. We are a non-profit organization, and as mentioned, our best practices are open source, which means that they can be utilized by anyone as well as adapted by anyone and used for profit thereto. They've been licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. The foundation's members, who are all volunteers and participate on a non-kind of profit or income basis, are principally machine learning engineers, data scientists, statisticians, legal professionals, UX professionals, and academics. So the best practices and the foundation itself is I would say, arguably derived from individuals who have a lot of insight into machine learning and specifically responsible machine learning across organization or the organization. Christopher, next slide, please. Okay, so Violeta, I think this is where you take it.
Yes, I can jump in here. So you might wonder, who are the best practices for? Well, when we were designing the best practices, we aimed to make them suitable for different audiences. We see that sometimes guidelines or principles out there are either for technical audience only or for non-technical audience only. But our best practices are suitable for both for data scientists and machine learning engineers, but also product owners and managers, different business stakeholders, legal and compliance professionals, etc. We also try to make the best practices suitable for different organizations, irrespective of the size, the risk, the domain, the maturity, the resources, or the societal impact of an organization. Next slide, please. So what have we done so far? At the core of what we do are the best practices. So think of them as two different documents. One is technical best practices and the other is our organizational best practices. We went live with the first version back in May, and our aim is to publish a new version in about six months or 7 months from now. And the technical and the organizational best practices are, we have to admit they're also kind of quite large, two large documents, because our purpose when we were writing the best practices was also to be as exhaustive as possible and as complete as possible. Of course, you can never be completely exhaustive when we're talking about such a rapidly developing problem such as responsible machine learning. But because the best practices themselves could be quite large, especially for people who are interacting with them for the first time, we designed also a lot of supporting material, which aims to actually ease the user's interaction with the best practices. For example, we have user guides, which are sort of one-pagers that kind of support each section of the best practices, and they give you the short story of what we're going to talk about in a section, why that is important, and a little bit of the how. The best practices are open source. You can download them from our website, which we'll share later. We also have a wiki page which contains the best practices, so you can also provide more concrete feedback for a certain section only or for a specific subsection. Next slide, please. So the technical best practices are about a single product, most often a machine learning model or AI model. And the organizational best practices are about the entire organization. The technical best practices are mediated through life cycle, product life cycle management, for example. And the organizational best practices are mediated through policies. We made sure that both best practices cover the same subjects, namely product management and topics such as fairness and non-discrimination, data quality, explainability, monitoring and maintenance, etc. I will not go through the whole list. And now Chris will tell you a little bit more in detail about the technical best practices.
Sure. Thanks, Violeta. So yeah, I'll go into some more detail about the technical best practices, which, as Violeta mentioned, it's a document we published in May. It's also paired with a wiki that updates more frequently. The purpose here, the scope of the document is really, we made a concerted effort to capture the full life cycle of a product. So from creating a team, gathering data, validating that data, building a model validation, implementation, ongoing monitoring, right? That full process, we're really trying to cover every step. The goal is to design a document that will be useful to all. Different sections will appeal to folks in different roles. Some are more or less technical, but all should be kind of readable by any sort of any of these folks listed here, any kind of player in the space of machine learning. Final detail about these, they're also product agnostic. So they should apply regardless of setting, whether it's credit, healthcare, pretty much regardless of what you're predicting using a machine learning algorithm or kind of what your task is. We wrote these best practices so that they still apply to your project. So we'll kind of zoom in one level. This is the table of contents, just lifted straight from the document. I won't go through these. I won't go through each of these sections, but hopefully it's clear that this is a fairly comprehensive document. And there's probably something in here that's useful for everybody on this call. There are two parts. The first part is product management piece. This kind of deals more with oversight of the product through the life cycle, like we've talked about. The second section, part B, more technical, more kind of model focused. These deal with sort of specific considerations around model development and deployment. I'll show just a snapshot of what the body of the document actually looks like. This is the beginning of our fairness and non-discrimination section. That's section 11. For each section, there are several individual topics like the three that I've shown here. Each of them have a control, which is essentially what should be done, what is the best practice here. And they also have an aim, which is essentially why you should do it, why should you care. The idea was to make these really concrete and applied so that it's not just sort of, it's a good idea to think about X, Y, Z. Really did try to make a point to say a little bit into kind of how you should do that and much more specifically what you should be doing. Just to go into this section, as example, when you're kind of thinking about fairness of an algorithm, first step, which is 11.1.1 here, is to define which groups will be subject to fairness testing. Second step, 11.1.2, gather information on group membership, either self-reported or reported by the individual or even proxied, and so on. There are 30 of these individual steps for just the fairness section, broken into a couple of subsections. And each of these chapters that we show here have similarly sort of comprehensive topics. Final point I would make, just that these are live documents. You can sign up and edit this wiki right now if if there's something here that you're passionate about, or if there are pieces that you'd like to kind of weigh in on. We also have discussions internally, and like Violeta said, plan to release new versions periodically. So really, it's sort of an organic, living set of best practices. So I will turn it back over to Daniel.
Me, thanks. So I'll talk about the organizational best practices, which is a kind of parallel document that's meant to complement the technical best practices kind of guidelines. The organizational best practices document tries to provide an overview on how best organizations can be structured to facilitate ethical and responsible machine learning. We all know, and at least if you pragmatically try to implement ethical and responsible machine learning, that it's pretty hard to do that without proper organizational structure and support. So this is what this document tries and achieve. The scope of the document relates to the entire organization. So we've really kind of taken a holistic perspective, and that is the main ethos of it. We want it to be as comprehensive as possible and allow numerous stakeholders to engage with it. So as you can see, the audience for this particular best practices document relates to product managers, business owners, governance experts, management as a whole, and legal compliance. And it's really important that this audience has a large variety, because often responsible and ethical machine learning can be misunderstood because it sits at the intersection between numerous disciplines. So it is really vital that this document focuses on the organization and tries to locate this kind of interdisciplinary science more holistically for everyone. The components of it, as you can see, are identified there. The first one relates to the organization. The next one relates, and that's that you should structure your organization, managerial oversight. The next facet touches on product and model management. So this is really warranting oversight for product teams, or whatever your development team is called, and how to facilitate managerial structures there. C relates to kind of resource management, which is really about making sure that teams are adequately staffed and that they have access to financial resources, as well as technical hardware and software to be able to adequately achieve the outcomes that they are expected to. D touches on issues around incident response. This can relate to security matters, as well as other kind of incidences that might relate to, perhaps issues around fairness and non-discrimination. And then the final aspect of the document touches on ethics, public interest, and legal. So this is the kind of more compliance-y aspects that relate to facilitating responsible machine learning within your organization. It's also important to note that each of the aspects that have been touched on in the technical best practices come through here in the organization best practices. So there's a particular subsection under product and model management that talks about fairness and non-discrimination, the necessity of having a policy, the necessity of having adequate training, the necessity of allowing managerial insight into that, making it a feature of KPIs, etc. So we try to harmonize the two documents as much as we can and make them integrated. So the organization best practice guideline, again, is how to structure an organization and help get it to facilitate responsible and ethical machine learning, or AI as it's commonly referred to. Christopher, the next slide, please. So this is our call to action. Naturally, we are a nonprofit organization. We're really open to everyone joining us collectively. We really want it to be a community forum that's driven by the community. As we've mentioned numerous times, all our best practices are open source, and there is also a corresponding wiki. The hope is that everyone can come in and contribute to this, and we can really democratize best practices and how to achieve responsible and ethical machine learning and AI, as it's more broadly called. This is kind of a social responsibility of us all, and collectively we can come together when the practice is democratized to kind of best achieve the outcomes we all hope to. So this is my call for action that I've been asked to do. You can use the QR code there, and you will be directed to our wiki site. I think the final slide now. Yep. So we're always looking for new volunteers, so please get in touch with us. If you want to get a copy of the best practices or contribute to it, there is our kind of website. I was going to say domain, but it's not. It's our website. I'll link to our website. And so please feel free to reach us on LinkedIn by using the QR code there. So perhaps we should open the session to the floor. But that's a high-level summary of what the foundation is.
Thank you, Chris, Daniel, and Violeta for an amazing presentation. And I do welcome anybody to submit a question through the chat. And maybe while we're waiting for questions to be submitted through the chat, I'll ask a few questions that I just received in advance. Maybe on a personal level, what I love about your framework is that it's ambitious in terms of its broad areas that it covers. And Daniel, Chris, and Violeta, if you want to turn your cameras on, this is a good time to do so. So I'll start with a question. Maybe it's definitely an ambitious framework in terms of all the broad areas that it covers. Help us understand the rigor that goes behind what ends up in the framework. Who decide what is a best practice, and how do you decide what is a best practice? I mean, it's a pretty bold statement to say these are the best practices. How did you end up there?
I will shoot for this first, and then I will turn to my colleagues to help. Essentially, there was a lot of academic research into this, as well as practical experience. I think collectively across the foundation, we have a couple of decades of experience between us. I'm not the leader in that front. I am one of the younger folks. So the best practices really come from a collection of industry experts and academic literature and more commercial literature about how to best operationalize machine learning, and especially in a more thorough, robust way. So that's principally where it comes from. We then collectively reviewed it amongst ourselves, and everyone gave feedback. We also informally approached other large organizations and small organizations and presented the best practices, and they gave us feedback on it, inclusive of, at some point, certain regulatory authorities. And that's essentially how the best practices came to being, right? So it was really a collective effort that was done behind closed doors. And now that we've released it to the general public, we hope that everyone can contribute to it and actually really challenge us. Like if you don't believe one of our suggestions is wise, you should say, hold up, this is just foolish and impractical. Violeta or Chris, does anyone else want to add to it?
Covered it pretty well. It's not much to add.
Okay, excellent. So definitely, and I suppose part of this being a community, open source community project, that it's open for those who disagree to come in and present a plausible argument. And if that's the case, and we're able to convince you, then that makes it to the next iteration. Now maybe I'll ask a question. I mean, you brought up the point of regulatory guidelines. I know there are some regulatory guidelines that have been issued with GDPR and the right to an explanation, and some initial regulations related to algorithmic fairness. Do you anticipate that there are more regulatory guidelines that are on the way, and organizations and teams that are early in adopting or thinking about best practices for machine learning are setting themselves up for success by anticipating regulation that is likely to come?
I guess I'm the lawyer here, so I will start, but I don't think I should dominate the discourse. Yeah, I think really trying to get your foot in and starting to utilizing best practices and just creating a robust way of how to approach machine learning and ML ops is really important to get ahead of the game. It's undoubtedly that there are more regulations coming in. Undoubtedly, there will be determined standards, and anything that's moving the needle towards a more structured, holistic subject is important. And we think that the best practices really go a long way in doing that. I mean, if you follow the best practices, in theory, you will meet all the outcomes that are required in terms of the upcoming EU AI regulations. In fact, you will go beyond that. So I would really say that the best practices is a really good first port of call. And at least in my company, it is it is a document which we reflect on in trying to implement our governance structure. Maybe Chris and Violeta have further contributions.
Sure. Yeah, one piece that makes me think of is just that, I'm more familiar with the landscape in the United States, but there has been a spread from sort of regulation from traditionally very highly regulated industries like credit into other spaces like insurance, and it's pretty easy to see that that spread continuing into industries that have not traditionally faced regulation on things like algorithms or machine learning. And I think, consistently the folks that are at least thinking about these things beforehand and have, capacity set up, be it a model governance review board or even kind of internal working groups, organizations that have existing structures like that already in place, seem to be much better equipped to handle regulation when it does appear. But it was definitely a challenge with this document, trying to make a set of best practices that's industry and country agnostic is tricky, and always has to have a little bit of a caveat of follow your local law and talk to a lawyer too, right? I mean, I don't think we want to be sort of replacing that advice. We want to be sort of augmenting it. Just a couple quick thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. In fact, as a lawyer, I should have highlighted that. Always follow your local laws and always abide by local legislation.
Okay, excellent. Now, Violeta, do you want to add anything? I have another question, but I'll probably just maybe I'll direct it to you first. And
yeah, sure. I mean, if to also address part of your question, which I think that Daniel and Chris didn't ask so much, you basically asked if we see some organizations out there which are already doing quite well when it comes to having their own frameworks of responsible AI, and whether we were inspired by some of them. Well, the short answer is no, because there is not really one organization that we see that has created some, at least open source guidelines to this extent. Of course, perhaps many organizations are doing this to a certain extent, but they're not sharing it with the rest of the world, which is of course completely fine. And that was also a little bit of our frustration and our purpose with creating the guidelines, to have something which is open source, so that organizations which don't have something in place already and maybe don't have the resources, don't have the time and the knowledge, have a place to start from.
okay, excellent. So I do have maybe an interesting question that I'm interested in here is a lot of or part of the frameworks talks about fairness and disparities and whatnot. And maybe I'll start with you, Violeta. What are your thoughts on achieving fairness through unawareness? That is, rather than allow an algorithm to use race, age, gender in its decision making, and then check if you ended up with a fair outcome based on a statistical test that I did not treat women worse than men or whatnot. What are your thoughts on just hiding those attributes and letting the algorithm not take them into account to begin with?
Yeah, that's not the way that I would go about in ensuring that the model or the data that I have is fair. There is actually, when it comes to fairness through an awareness, there's one sort of complexity, at least when it comes to fairness in the EU, which I don't see people talk about, which is that according to the GDPR, you're not even allowed to process certain sensitive attributes. So it becomes really tricky to even gauge upon or to measure, to say something about how fair or unfair is your model with respect to those attributes. Of course, fairness through an awareness is one rudimentary approach that you go about. With our best practices, we don't say you should go for this fairness definitions versus that fairness definition, because when it comes to fairness, there are so many different sort of fairness metrics or definitions that you can go about. They're very much dependent on the context, on the problem that you're working with. And the short answer is that there is always a trade-off. You can never be fair to everyone at the same time. In fact, there are certain fairness definitions that are kind of mutually exclusive. They cannot be satisfied at the same time. So it's really about the trade-off, and it's about what is important to your stakeholders in the problem that you're working with, what kind of fairness definition they would like to go with, basically what kind of harm they want to minimize given the problem that you're working on.
I think just to maybe provide some clarity, in the upcoming EU regulation, as well as I believe you can argue under the GDPR, you can use sensitive for these purposes, specifically of finding or highlighting discrimination and in assessing fairness. And I think it's really important that you keep sensitive attributes in that determination. I think it would be disingenuous to take them out of your model completely, because there might be other proxy variables that you're unaware of that facilitate this relationship. So it's a really important feature to have in your models, and it would be actually irresponsible not to. So that's at least my thoughts on the subject matter. I know Chris works a lot in this domain.
So yeah, Chris, we're curious on your thoughts. I mean, I know for a living you audit companies that to see if they have these issues, and you offer remediation steps. So help us, based on your practical experience, understand what are your thoughts on this question. Yeah.
Sure. And this is one of those places where we can lean a little bit more in the US on regulatory guidance and existing case law. Disparate impact theory is pretty well established, which is just sort of the idea that if you are in the model context, if you are using a model, if you're using attributes, if your model is resulting in negative adverse actions for a protected group, then you are subject to certain risk. And you need to make sure that you're doing so for business justified reasons, and that there's no way to sort of avoid that and continue to achieve those business purposes. So, like Daniel said, fairness through unawareness still leaves you exposed to a lot of risk because of proxies for sensitive attributes. So, in the US, especially, geography is a very strong proxy for Black or African American individuals. Shopping habits, some of this more kind of alternative data, very easy for that to end up acting as a proxy for a demographic group or some prohibited basis. These issues are also, they're amplified in a lot of the settings that we're kind of moving more into. As models get larger in terms of the number of features that you're using, as they get more complex, right? Shifting from your logistic regressions to your neural networks, as the data gets more unfamiliar, all of these things get more difficult to kind of anticipate beforehand. So, it just becomes even more important to actually test your models for fairness and not just sort of feel safe that, well, I'm not using race in my model. I'm not using anything that looks like an obvious proxy for race, so I'm probably okay. I think that strategy is becoming less and less appropriate as complexity grows.
Okay. Now, Daniel, you want to add something else?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just going to make this comment, and it's a passing comment, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but the best practice beyond fairness and just non-discrimination, right? I know it's a very topical issue, but it really touches on the issues like security and robustness, and all of these aspects are interrelated, but it's important that we focus on these other aspects, right? Like data quality, and monitoring and maintenance, and another vogue conversation piece at the moment is explainability. But all of these aspects are really necessary in order to achieve responsible and ethical machine learning, and none of them can be left out of the picture. If you do that, you're being a bit disingenuous to the effort, and I think that should be highlighted.
Yeah, that's a great, and you can do all the fairness testing you want, but if your data is garbage going in, it's not going to be very good, right? Explainability is really effective in learning why your model might be causing inequities and can help motivate the fairness piece. A lot of these are systemically very tied to each other.
Okay, excellent. So I think as we, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this session, and we're about to wrap up here. And maybe if I can just ask you to go back to the slide that has the site in which people could find your organization at, and potentially be part of the conversation and be part of this effort. So last pitch here. This is I personally believe this is a great foundation that has a lot of positive things to contribute to the community. And I would urge everyone to participate and be involved as much as they can. And if you disagree with something, then this is a community-owned effort. Let's have a conversation and move the conversation forward. Thank you all, Violeta, Chris, and Daniel, for an awesome presentation. And I look forward, and I invite everybody, if you enjoyed what we've talked about today, in about less than 10 minutes, we're going to have another panel discussion on responsible AI, and more to come at that subsequent session. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, I'll stop it.